The blizzard came without warning, the way most things in the Wyoming Territory did in the winter of 1882, and Pauline Blackwell found herself standing on the main street of Harlan Creek, with nothing but a thin wool shawl between her skin and the killing cold. She had arrived on the afternoon stage from Cheyenne with $42 sewn into the hem of her dress, a carpetbag that contained everything she owned in the world, and a letter of employment from a woman named Hester Drummond who ran the only millinery shop in town. The letter had promised warm lodgings, a fair wage, and honest work. What it had not promised, and what Pauline had not thought to ask about, was what happened when the stage dropped you at the edge of town, and the driver pointed vaguely toward a row of buildings, and said the shop was somewhere down that way before he snapped his reins and disappeared in a cloud of frozen dust. Pauline had been walking for 20 minutes, and she could no longer feel her fingers. The wind off the mountains came in great violent sheets, driving snow sideways and turning the late afternoon sky the color of iron. The handful of townspeople who had been out on the boardwalks had vanished inside as if they had never existed, every door pulled shut, every window fogged with the warmth of inside fires. Harlan Creek looked like an abandoned painting. The buildings stood dark and silent, their false fronts collecting snow along their upper edges, the hand-lettered signs above the doors beginning to creak and swing in the gusts. She stopped in front of what appeared to be a general store and pressed her hand against her eyes to shield them from the wind, trying to read the signs on the buildings further down the block. Her shawl pulled loose and snapped behind her like a flag, and she grabbed it back with both hands, pressing it flat against her chest, but it did little good. The cold had already found the spaces between the threads. She could feel it settling into her bones the way water settles into cracked wood. She was 24 years old. She had buried her mother in Denver 6 weeks ago and spent the rest of her small savings on a train ticket and then a stage ticket and the letter in her carpetbag telling her there was work waiting. She was not the kind of woman who cried easily. She had been through too much for easy tears. But standing there in the white roar of that blizzard, with her fingers going numb and her feet soaking through her boots and not a single human soul in sight, she felt something very close to despair begin to settle in her chest. She turned in a slow circle, looking for any building with a light in the window, any sign of life. The snow was coming so thick now that she could barely see 20 feet in any direction. She could not remember which way she had come from the stage stop. She was beginning to think she might actually freeze to death right here on the main street of a town she had never seen before in her life, which would have been a profoundly miserable end to an already miserable 6 weeks. She heard boots on the boardwalk before she saw him. The sound was deliberate and unhurried, which struck her as strange given the weather, the kind of footfall that belonged to a man who had never been rushed by anything in his life. He appeared out of the white blur like a figure stepping through a curtain, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a sheepskin-lined coat that looked heavy enough to anchor a ship. He had a hat pulled low against the wind, and his face was turned slightly down, and for a moment she thought he might walk right past her without noticing she was there. He stopped. He looked at her, not the quick, dismissive glance of a man who had somewhere to be, but a long, steady assessment that took in the thin shawl and the carpetbag and the blue-white color of her lips with an expression that was not quite alarm but was several steps past concern. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You have no coat." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact delivered in a low, even voice that carried through the wind without effort. "I noticed," Pauline said, because she was too cold and too tired to be anything but direct. He reached up without any preamble or ceremony and began unbuttoning his coat. He had it off in about 10 seconds and he held it out to her, and she stared at it for a moment because the gesture was so unexpected and so immediate that she did not quite know what to do with it. "I cannot take your coat," she said. "You will freeze." "I have a wool vest and a flannel shirt under this," he said. "And I am 20 feet from a door that leads inside. You, on the other hand, are in serious trouble." She looked at him. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two more, with dark hair that the wind had pushed out from under the back of his hat, and a jaw that was clean-shaved, and a pair of eyes that were a very particular shade of gray that she could see even through the blowing snow. He looked steady. He looked like a man who knew exactly what he was doing and why. She took the coat. She put it on, and it fell to her knees, and the warmth that had been stored in the sheepskin lining hit her like a wall, and she made a sound that was involuntary and embarrassing, a small exhale of pure relief. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that went several layers deeper than the word usually carried. "The millinery shop is 3 buildings down on your left," he said. "Hester Drummond keeps a good stove." She stared at him. "How did you know I was looking for the millinery shop?" "You arrived on the afternoon stage," he said. "Hester has been expecting someone for 2 weeks. The fact that you are standing in the middle of a blizzard with a carpetbag and no coat suggests you are new to town and did not quite make it to your destination." It was logical. It was completely logical. But the certainty with which he said it made her feel as though she had somehow been read like a letter without her consent. "You should get inside," she said. "You have no coat now, on account of me." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "I know where all the doors in this town are," he said. "Go on. Hester is probably watching for you." Pauline went, turning once to look back at him, but the snow had already closed behind her like a curtain and he was gone. She found the millinery shop exactly where he had said it would be. Hester Drummond turned out to be a round, warm-faced woman of about 50 who yanked Pauline inside by the arm and installed her immediately in front of a cast-iron stove with a mug of hot coffee in her hands before she had managed to get a single word out. When Hester noticed the coat, she went very still for a moment and looked at Pauline with an expression Pauline could not quite decode. "Where did you get that coat?" Hester asked. Pauline explained, the tall man, the street, the blizzard, the way he had given it to her without any hesitation at all. Hester sat down slowly in the chair across from her and looked at the coat with a different sort of attention. "Tall man," Hester said. "Gray eyes, walks like he owns the ground under his feet." "That description fits," Pauline said. "Who is he?" Hester poured herself a small measure from the coffee pot before she answered. "Theodore Hayes," she said carefully, the way you say a name that carries weight. "He owns the mill. He owns the bank. He owns the land this building sits on and that one and most of the ones down this block and the next. He built the water tower and funded the new schoolhouse, and he has a hand in every deal that comes through this territory." She paused. "He owns Harlan Creek, Miss Blackwell. In every way a man can own a town short of having his name printed on the deed to the earth itself." Pauline looked down at the coat in her lap. It was beautifully made. She could see that now in the warmth and light of the shop. The sheepskin lining was thick and even, the stitching along the seams precise and double reinforced. There was a quality to the materials that went far beyond what most working men wore. She felt suddenly, profoundly foolish. "He did not introduce himself," she said. "Theodore Hayes never announces himself," Hester said with the tone of a woman relaying a well-established fact. "Doesn't need to. Everybody in 50 miles already knows who he is." "Except me," Pauline said. "Except you," Hester agreed, and there was a warmth to her voice now, a careful amusement. "You will need to return his coat, of course." "Of course," Pauline said. She looked at the coat again. The warmth of it had seeped all the way through her by now, and she thought she might be able to feel her fingers again. "Tomorrow." She slept that night in the small room above the millinery shop that Hester had prepared for her, on a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt and a window that rattled in the wind all night long. She could hear the blizzard working itself out over the mountains, and she lay awake for a while listening to it, and thinking about gray eyes and a coat handed over without a second thought, and the particular unsettling quality of a man who read you like an open book. She had come to Harlan Creek for work, for a quiet life, for a chance to build something stable after the upheaval of the past year. She had not come for complications. She resolved, with the practical firmness that had carried her through everything else, to return the coat in the morning, and that would be the end of it. The morning came bright and viciously cold, the town buried under 2 feet of new snow and the sky washed out to a pale, brilliant blue. The blizzard had passed, leaving everything redrawn in white. The streets were quiet, the air sharp as a blade. Pauline dressed carefully, wrapped herself in every layer she could manage, and put on Theodore Hayes's coat over all of it because she was not a fool about warmth. She asked Hester where the man could be found. Hester said he was usually in his office at the mill before sunrise, and that the mill was at the north end of town, past the livery stable and the blacksmith's shop, a big 2-story building with a water wheel on the east side that ran off the creek. Pauline found it without difficulty. The building was larger than she had expected, and there were already men moving around the lower level even at that early hour, loading wagons and stacking lumber in the cold air. She went to the door that appeared to lead to the upper offices and knocked. A young man with ink on his fingers answered and told her that Mr. Hayes was in and would she wait. She waited in a narrow hall for perhaps 5 minutes, listening to the low sounds of business being conducted behind a closed door, a deep voice speaking in measured tones, another voice answering, the rustle of papers. Then the door opened, and 2 men in good coats and cold expressions came out, and the young man with the ink-stained fingers gestured for her to go in. The office was spare and functional. A large desk dominated the center of the room, covered in maps and ledgers and correspondence stacked in organized columns. A cast-iron stove in the corner threw out substantial heat. The wall behind the desk held a large window that looked out over the creek, which was frozen solid and brilliant in the morning light. Theodore Hayes was standing at the window with his back to her when she came in. He turned when he heard the door. He was exactly as she remembered, which was somehow both reassuring and unsettling. In the daylight, without the snow driving between them, she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 31 or 32, she judged, with a lean, angular quality to his face that suggested someone who did not waste time on unnecessary things. He was dressed simply but well, dark trousers and a white shirt and a wool vest, and he was looking at his coat on her shoulders with an expression of what she could only describe as mild satisfaction. "Miss Blackwell," he said. "Good morning. How are your fingers?" She blinked. "My fingers. They were going white yesterday," he said. "Frostbite. They are fine," she said. "Thank you." She crossed the room and laid the coat carefully over the back of the chair beside his desk. "I came to return this. I am grateful. I don't think I was in a good situation out there." "You were not," he agreed, without any drama. "You knew my name," she said. It had just occurred to her. "You said my name just now. Good morning, Miss Blackwell. I did not tell you my name yesterday." He looked at her steadily. "Hester Drummond wrote to me 2 weeks ago asking if the roads to the south would be passable before the first hard snow. She mentioned she was expecting a new employee on the stage from Cheyenne. A Miss Pauline Blackwell from Denver. When I saw you on the street yesterday, I put the pieces together." "You know a great deal about the workings of this town," she said. "It is my town to know," he said simply. Not with arrogance exactly, more with the matter-of-fact quality of someone stating an obvious truth. "So Hester tells me," Pauline said. She looked at him evenly. She was not a woman who was easily intimidated, and she had decided on the walk over that she was not going to be intimidated now. "I appreciate the coat. I hope the cold did not trouble you too greatly on your way inside." "It did not," he said. "Would you like coffee? I was about to have some." She had not expected that. She had expected a formal, brief acknowledgement and then to be shown the door. She stood for a moment, recalibrating. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He poured from a pot that sat on a small shelf near the stove and brought her a cup and took his own and went back to his position, not behind the desk this time but beside the window as though he preferred to have the light behind him. She sat in the chair beside his desk. They drank their coffee in silence for a moment, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which she found strange. Most silences with strangers were uncomfortable. "What brought you from Denver?" he asked. "Work," she said. "My mother passed away in October. She was the last of my family. I needed to find a situation and Hester's advertisement found me first. I am sorry about your mother, he said. Thank you, she said. It was the same exchange she had been having with people for 6 weeks, but when he said it, it did not feel automatic. He said it the way a man says something he actually means. Do you have experience with millinery work, he asked. Some, she said. I am a quick learner and I am not afraid of work. That is worth more than experience, usually. Something shifted in his expression. The near smile again, the one she had seen in the storm. It usually is, he agreed. She finished her coffee and stood. He walked her to the door, which she had not expected either. If you need anything while you are settling in, he said, at the door to the outer hall, Hester knows how to reach me. The town takes care of its own. She looked at him. I am not yet one of the town's own, she said. I only arrived yesterday. You will be, he said. Harlan Creek keeps people who belong to it. She thought about that on the walk back to the millinery shop, her boots crunching through the fresh snow, the air so clean and cold it made her eyes water. She thought about whether she wanted to belong to a town that was owned by a single man. She thought about what it meant, that word owned, and what it felt like, and whether it was different from what she had always imagined it would feel like, which was oppressive and wrong. The truth was, it had not felt that way at all. It had felt like a man who knew his town and cared for it the way a person cares for something they have built. She was not sure what to do with that. The weeks that followed were the kind that settle a person into a place. Pauline learned the rhythms of the millinery shop, the customers who came in every week and those who came in for special occasions, the way Hester liked things organized, and the way the accounts were kept, and the best way to manage the delivery of supplies from the merchant in Cheyenne. She had a steady hand and a good eye, and she found she enjoyed the work more than she had expected, the small craft of making things that pleased people, the conversations that happened over a counter when a woman was trying on a hat. She learned the town too. The saloon on the corner that was rowdy but not dangerous, the doctor's office that doubled as a dentist's and sometimes as a barber's depending on what was needed. The telegraph office where the young operator, a boy named Clarence, was desperately in love with the baker's daughter and spent most of his shift staring out the window. The livery stable where a man named Dell, old and deliberate, knew the lineage of every horse in the county and could tell you their character to a nicety. The schoolhouse that Theodore Hayes had funded, with its new wooden floor and its good iron stove, and the young teacher from Ohio who was afraid of everything but taught with a passion that overcame fear. She saw Theodore Hayes twice during those first weeks. The first time was across the street. He was walking with 2 other men, talking, and he glanced up and saw her and nodded once, the kind of acknowledgement that said he had noticed her and remembered her without requiring any interruption of his current business. She nodded back and kept walking. The second time was at the general store, where they arrived at the counter at the same moment from opposite sides and both reached for the same spool of heavy thread and then stopped when their hands nearly touched and looked at each other, and both stepped back with identical expressions of courtesy. After you, he said. It is for the shop, she said unnecessarily. Hester needed it. Then it is more necessary for you than for me, he said and stepped aside. She bought the thread and he waited, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, and when she turned to go she caught him watching her with an expression that was difficult to name, something thoughtful and careful, like a man who has noticed something and is still deciding what it is. She went back to the shop and put Hester's thread on the workbench and told herself, firmly and clearly, that she was here to work and to build a life, and that the owner of the town was not relevant to that project. It was in December that things changed. The town held a Christmas social in the first week of December, hosted in the new schoolhouse, which was the largest interior space in Harlan Creek that was not a saloon. The tables were pushed to the walls, and the teacher from Ohio played the fiddle, which no one had known about and which he was apparently very good at. And there was food and dancing, and the particular warmth that fills a cold climate room when people have come together specifically to be warm. Pauline went with Hester, who knew everyone and performed introductions with the efficiency of a woman who enjoyed the work. Pauline met the banker and his wife and the blacksmith and his 3 daughters and the doctor, who was a small, precise man named Dr. Ellery, who shook her hand and said he was glad to see new faces because Harlan Creek needed them. And she met the cattle rancher who owned the spread south of town and his foreman and half a dozen other people whose names she sorted carefully and attached to their faces. Theodore Hayes arrived late. He came in with the kind of low, unremarkable entrance that a man of his position in any other context might have turned into theater, and did not. He hung his coat by the door and took a glass of cider from the table along the wall and stood near the back of the room watching the dancing with an expression of benign, somewhat distant interest. Hester leaned toward Pauline and said under the music, "He always comes, never dances, every year since he built the schoolhouse." "Why doesn't he dance?" Pauline asked. "No one to dance with," Hester said simply. "He's been alone a long time." Pauline watched him for a moment across the room. He was talking now with the rancher from south of town, but his eyes moved over the room at intervals with a particular attentiveness, the way a man watches a room he is responsible for. He saw her watching him, and she did not look away immediately, which she had not intended, but there it was. He held her gaze for a moment, and then the rancher said something and his attention moved back, and she turned away and went to get more cider because she needed something to do with her hands. She was standing near the fiddle player when he appeared at her elbow. "Miss Blackwell," he said. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "Are you settling in well?" he asked. "Very well, thank you," she said. "Hester is good company and the work suits me." "And the town?" he asked. "Is it what you expected?" She considered the question honestly. "I did not have many expectations," she said. "I needed a place to start over. I think this might be a place where that is possible." He looked at her. Something in his expression changed, the careful distance of it opening slightly like a window just barely raised. "Starting over is harder than it sounds," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." There was a pause, and then he said, "Would you like to dance?" It surprised her enough that she said yes before she had entirely decided to. And then there they were on the floor with the fiddle going bright and quick, and his hand was at her waist, and hers on his shoulder, and they danced. He was not graceful exactly, not practiced, but he was steady and sure in the way he was steady and sure in everything, and she found that steadiness easier to follow than grace would have been. He did not talk while they danced. Neither did she. The music was bright and the room was warm and the people around them were laughing, and she thought, at some point between the beginning of the song and the end of it, that she had not felt this particular quality of warmth since before her mother had gotten sick. It was not a grand or overwhelming feeling. It was small and solid and real, the way good things usually were. When the song ended, he stepped back and thanked her, and she thanked him, and Hester appeared at her elbow with the expression of a woman who had noticed absolutely everything and was saying nothing, which was in some ways worse. They danced again later, when the fiddle player shifted to a slower tune. This time there was less distance between them than there had been the first time, not dramatically less, but enough that she was aware of it, the narrowing of the air between his shoulder and her face, the steadiness of his hand at her back. "I owe you something," she said. "What?" he said. "I never thanked you properly," she said. "For the coat, in the blizzard. I was fairly rude about it, I think. I was very cold." "You thanked me," he said, "in the moment and the next morning." "I was not very gracious about it," she said. "I did not require grace," he said. "You were cold, you needed a coat, it was a straightforward situation." "Not everyone would see it that way," she said. "Not everyone would need to," he said. She thought about that. About the way he had given the coat over without thinking, without calculation, in a moment when most powerful men would have been very busy thinking and calculating. It told her something about the man that the facts of his position did not. She looked up at him and found that he was already looking at her, and the look was direct and quiet, and she felt it somewhere in the center of her chest, a small, steady pressure, like a hand placed over a door. She looked away before she did anything she would have to explain to herself later. The days after the social were both easier and harder. Easier because she knew something now about what the situation was, something she could see clearly even if she had not named it. Harder because knowing a thing and knowing what to do about it were entirely separate problems. She kept herself busy, which was not difficult. December in the Wyoming Territory was not a month that allowed for idleness. The shop was busy with Christmas orders, hats and ribbons and winter bonnets, and Hester was in and out on errands, and Pauline ran the counter for long stretches on her own. She was good at it. She liked the people, the way they talked across the counter about their lives, the small urgencies and happinesses of a frontier town in winter. Theodore Hayes came into the shop on a Thursday morning in the second week of December. He had never come into the shop before. He came in with his hat in his hand and the cold air coming off his coat, and he stood at the counter with the slightly uncertain quality of a man who has decided to do something and is now doing it regardless of whether he is comfortable about it. "Good morning," Pauline said. She kept her voice even and professional. "Good morning," he said. "I need a hat." She looked at him. He was wearing a perfectly good hat. She did not say this. "For whom?" she asked. "Is it a gift?" He paused. "For Maribeth Colton," he said. "She works at the laundry. Her husband died this past summer, and she has 3 children, and I believe she has not had a new hat since the funeral one." Pauline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What color?" "Dark green," he said, after a second's consideration. "She has dark hair. I think dark green would suit her." They spent the better part of 20 minutes going through Hester's stock and Pauline's own judgment, and in the end they found a dark green wool bonnet with a ribbon trim that was warm and handsome and entirely practical for a working woman in winter. Theodore Hayes paid for it without looking at the price, which was not nothing, and asked Pauline to have it wrapped and delivered. After he left, Hester came out of the back room with the expression of a woman who had heard the whole thing. "He does that," Hester said. "Every Christmas. He buys something for 3 or 4 of the widows or the families that have had a hard year, never makes a ceremony of it, never tells anyone it's from him, just makes sure it gets done." Pauline looked at the door he had gone out of. She was doing something she had told herself she was not going to do, which was revising her understanding of Theodore Hayes upward at every new piece of information. It was inconvenient. "He is not what I expected," she said. "People who own a great deal are rarely what anyone expects," Hester said. "Either worse or better, he is the better kind." He came back 2 days later. This time he said he needed advice about a ribbon for his housekeeper's daughter who was getting married in the spring. Pauline helped him with that too, and when that was done he lingered for a moment at the counter longer than the transaction required, and she waited, and he said, "The creek freezes solid enough to walk on by the end of December. Some of the families go out with lanterns on the solstice. It's become a kind of custom. Would you like to go?" She looked at him carefully. "You are inviting me to a community gathering," she said. "I am," he said. "That is a somewhat formal way to ask a person to do something." Something in his expression shifted, and he said, without the careful formality, "I would like to go with you if you're willing. That is what I mean." She was willing. She said so, and the near smile appeared, and he put his hat back on and went out into the December cold. The solstice gathering was on the 21st. A clear night with stars so thick and bright they seemed almost theatrical, and the creek frozen flat and silver under them. Half the town came out with oil lanterns, and the light scattered across the ice in warm, moving points, and the children ran and slid, and their laughter went up into the cold dark and dissipated into the stars. Theodore Hayes and Pauline Blackwell walked side by side along the bank. They talked, really talked, in a way they had not managed in any of their previous encounters, which had all had the quality of being observed and therefore partly performed. Out here in the dark and cold, with the lanterns moving and the children's voices in the middle distance, it was easier to be plain. She told him about Denver, about her mother's illness and the long, slow months of it, about what it felt like to watch a woman who had been the center of your whole life recede from it. He listened without interrupting and without looking away, and she had the sense that she was being heard in a thorough way. He told her about building the mill, about arriving in Wyoming 11 years ago with a stake from a mining claim he had worked at 18, and a piece of land a man had sold him for less than it was worth because the man needed cash fast. He told her about the years of work, the slow accumulation, the deals that had gone wrong and the ones that had gone right, the mill that had grown into the bank and the land and the water tower. He told her about the drought 2 years ago that had nearly broken 3 ranching families and how the bank had carried their loans without calling them in because the alternative was watching people who had built their lives here lose everything, and that was not something he was willing to do. "You could have made a great deal of money from the drought," she said. "Yes," he said, "I could have. But you didn't." "No, why not?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the lantern light on the ice. "My father made his money the first way," he said, taking what the situation offered without thinking about what it cost the people on the other side of the ledger. "I watched him do it for 20 years. I decided I would rather build something I could stand behind." Pauline thought about that. "That is a harder way to do things," she said. "Most things worth doing are harder," he said. They stopped walking. They were at the bend in the creek where the ice ran wide and flat and the bank curved up to a stand of cottonwoods, bare and silver-black against the star-filled sky. A group of children went sliding past on the ice 20 feet away, yelling with joy. The lantern swayed in a light wind. "I am glad I came to Harlan Creek," Pauline said honestly. "I was not sure I would be. I was afraid it was just running away." "Is it?" he asked. She considered. "No," she said. "I think it might be the first time I've run toward something." He looked at her. In the lantern light, his gray eyes were warm in a way she had not seen before, some quality of guardedness in them quietly removed like a shutter opened. "I think that too," he said, and she understood that he was talking about more than her situation or not only about it, and she felt the small, steady pressure in her chest again, stronger this time. She did not look away. It was a slow winter, and a beautiful one, cold in the way Wyoming could be cold, that made you understand why people built things, why walls and fires and communities existed. Pauline worked and learned and put down roots in the careful way that she did everything, methodically and with attention. She made friends, real ones. The baker's wife, Clara Whitmore, who was sharp and funny and baked bread that was legitimately transcendent. The doctor's assistant, a young woman named Ida Mee who had come from Kansas and who had opinions about everything and shared them freely. Even Dell at the livery, who said very little but meant every word of it. Theodore Hayes was a presence in those months in the way a river is a presence in a landscape, constant and shaping, and not always visible but always there. She saw him at the social gatherings that punctuated the winter, and he came into the shop 2 or 3 times a month with purposes that were sometimes transparent and sometimes less so. They took 3 more walks along the frozen creek. They talked about books, which she had feared he might not read and which he read extensively, and about the territory's politics, which were complicated and contentious, and which he had views on that were more nuanced than she had expected. They talked about the schoolteacher's plans for a spring theatrical, and about the best way to manage frozen pipes, and about the particular quality of Wyoming light in January, which was different from any light she had seen anywhere else, clear and thin, and somehow searching. He was not demonstrative. He was not a man who spoke his feelings out loud in the moment. But she learned to read the other language he spoke, the language of presence and attention and small deliberate acts. The way he always knew which topics she was interested in, and guided conversation toward them. The way he remembered everything she told him, every detail, so that weeks later he would ask about something she had mentioned in passing, and she would have to think for a moment to remember saying it. The way he arranged, without apparent effort, to be walking past the shop when she closed it for the evening on the nights when she had told him she was walking home alone. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way you know most true things, not in a sudden revelation but in an accumulation of evidence that eventually becomes undeniable. What she was not sure of was whether he was falling in love with her or whether she was a pleasant addition to a life that was already very full and very organized. Hester settled that question for her in February, in a way that was characteristically Hester, which was to say direct and slightly uncomfortable. "He has not looked at a woman in 7 years," Hester said, over their evening coffee, while the wind outside made the windows rattle. "Since his wife died." Pauline went very still. "I did not know he had been married." "Her name was Charlotte," Hester said, watching her carefully. "She died of fever in the winter of 1875. They had only been married 2 years. He took it very hard." She paused. "He has looked at you the way he looked at Charlotte. I saw it at the solstice, and I've been watching since then to make sure I wasn't imagining it." Pauline put her coffee mug down carefully. She thought about gray eyes and a coat handed over without hesitation and conversations beside a frozen creek in lantern light. "He has not said anything to me," she said. "He won't," Hester said. "Not until he's sure. He's afraid of it. What he felt when Charlotte died was not something he intends to feel again unless he's absolutely certain it's worth it." She paused again. "He's a man who needs to know that what he builds is solid before he builds it." "And how does he find that out?" Pauline asked. Hester smiled, which had a quality of ancient wisdom about it that Pauline found both comforting and slightly alarming. "By building," she said, "which is what he has been doing this winter. With you." Pauline walked home that night in the cold and the clarity of February dark and thought about what building meant, the particular courage of it, of putting things together one piece at a time with the knowledge that all of it could fall. She thought she understood him better now. She thought the understanding made her love him more carefully, which was perhaps the right way to love someone who had been broken before. In March, when the first hard thaw came and the creek ran loud and fast with snowmelt, and the mud on the main street reached the tops of everyone's boots, a man came to Harlan Creek who changed the shape of things. His name was Horace Pittman, and he arrived on the stage from Laramie with a lawyer's case and an air of importance that he wore like expensive clothing. He installed himself at the hotel and began asking questions about the land north of the mill, the stretch along the upper creek where the timber was good and the elevation made it suitable for a second mill operation. Theodore Hayes owned that land. He had owned it for 8 years. But Horace Pittman said, with the confidence of a man holding documentation, that there was a question about the original survey, a discrepancy in the boundary lines that had been drawn when the territory was first mapped, and that the land might not be as clearly Hayes's as it had always appeared. The town noticed. In a place where Theodore Hayes was as foundational as the earth itself, the suggestion that something he owned might be challenged was the kind of information that moved through the community in about 4 hours. Pauline heard about it from Ida Mee, who had heard it from the clerk at the hotel, who had overheard Pittman speaking to his associate over dinner. She heard it and felt a cold, specific anxiety that she recognized, after a moment, as personal, as though the threat was not to a piece of land but to something that mattered to her. She did not see Theodore Hayes for 3 days after Pittman's arrival, which was unusual. When she did see him, it was a Thursday morning, and he came into the shop with his hat in his hand and a tiredness around his eyes that had not been there before, though his expression was otherwise as composed as always. "I heard about the land survey," she said, not because she had planned to say it first but because she could not stand the alternative, which was to pretend she had not. He looked at her. "News travels," he said without bitterness. "Is it serious?" she asked. "Pittman represents a timber company out of Chicago," he said. "They want the Upper Creek land for a mill operation. They found a surveyor willing to swear that the original boundary lines were drawn wrong and that the land falls outside my original claim." He paused. "It is not serious. My lawyer is coming from Cheyenne next week and we will address it properly, but it creates noise." "And noise bothers you," she said. "Noise distracts," he said. "There are things more important than noise that I would rather be paying attention to." She held his gaze. "Such as?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could hear the shop clock on the wall and Hester moving in the back room and the thin winter wind against the glass, and then he said, "I would like to take a walk with you this evening, if you're free." "I am free," she said. They walked that evening out beyond the edge of town, along the creek path that was still muddy from the thaw but passable, with the early spring sky going green and then purple above the mountains. There was a quality to the air that was different from winter, something loosening in it, a suggestion of warmth gathering somewhere in the distance. He talked about the land dispute more than he usually talked about business, and she understood that he was talking about it partly to talk about the thing that the dispute had clarified, which was that what he had built could be threatened and that what he valued was therefore worth knowing clearly. "My father thought land was power," he said. "I used to think the same thing. I don't think that anymore." "What is power, then?" she asked. He was quiet for a while, which with him was never evasive, only careful. They had reached the place where the creek bent wide, and the cottonwoods were beginning to show the first pale green haze of buds. "Choosing well," he said at last. "Choosing what to build and what to protect and who to trust with the things that matter." He paused and then turned and looked at her with that direct, quiet look that she had come to understand was how he said the largest things. "I want to tell you something." "All right," she said. "I have been very careful," he said, "about letting people into my life in the way that means something. I have been careful to a fault. I know that." He looked at the creek. "When Charlotte died, I made myself a kind of promise that I wouldn't risk it again unless I was absolutely certain. I have been waiting for certainty for 7 years." Her heart was doing something complicated. She kept her voice quiet. And I have realized," he said, "that what I have been calling certainty is actually fear with better vocabulary." He looked at her again. "You have been in this town for 4 months. I feel more certain about you than I have felt about anything in 7 years, and I am standing here still waiting to feel more certain, and I think I need to stop doing that." "Theodore," she said. She used his given name for the first time, without having planned to, and saw the effect of it in his face. "I love you," he said, directly and without performance, and with the particular gravity of a man saying the most important true thing he knows. "I want you to know that. I do not expect anything in return. I only want you to know." Pauline stood in the early spring evening with the creek running beside her, and the cottonwoods going green, and the mountains still white above the dark line of the pines, and felt the whole weight of the past several months settle and resolve into something simple and clear. "I love you too," she said. "I have been loving you since the solstice, at minimum. Possibly since you handed me your coat in a blizzard and told me the millinery shop was 3 buildings down on the left." The near smile became, finally and fully, a real one. It changed his whole face, and she thought she might remember that moment for the rest of her life. The creek sound and the green sky and Theodore Hayes smiling for real in the early spring dusk. He reached out and took her hand, which he had never done before, and held it with a steadiness that felt like everything he had ever said without words. They stood there for a long time as the light left the sky. The spring brought changes on several fronts at once, which was its habit. Horace Pittman's claim to the Upper Creek land was examined by 2 surveyors, the results of which confirmed what Theodore's original documents showed, that the boundary lines were exactly where they had always been, and that Pittman's surveyor had, charitably described, misread his instruments, and, less charitably described, falsified his findings to serve a client. Pittman left Harlan Creek on the May stage without ceremony and without success, and the timber company from Chicago turned its attention elsewhere. Theodore Hayes paid the legal fees and returned to his regular business without celebration or public comment on the matter, which was entirely consistent with everything Pauline knew about him by then. What he did celebrate, quietly and privately, was a question he asked her on a Saturday afternoon in May, when the spring was fully arrived, and the town was warm, and the creek ran bright in the afternoon sun, and they were sitting on the bench outside the millinery shop sharing a piece of cornbread Clara Whitmore had sent over because Clara had decided they needed fattening up and had opinions about how to achieve this. He said, "I would like to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, not because you feel you owe me anything, but because your honest answer is the only one that would mean anything." She set down her cornbread and looked at him. "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. No ceremony about it, no speech. Just the question, direct and honest, and his gray eyes on her face. "Yes," she said, equally directly, equally honestly. "Absolutely yes." They were married in July in the new schoolhouse, because it was the largest indoor space in town, and also because Theodore had built it and Pauline had decided she wanted to be married somewhere he had built, which said something she could not quite articulate but which felt right. Half the town came, which was most of the town, because there were not that many people in Harlan Creek, and news of this particular wedding had been anticipated for long enough that everyone had cleared their calendars. Hester cried, which she denied afterward, and which everyone had seen. Ida Mee stood with Pauline and wore a blue dress and held the flowers. Dell from the livery came in his good coat that he clearly had not worn since the previous Christmas social, and sat in the front row and looked deeply satisfied, which was his version of crying. The teacher from Ohio played the fiddle, something slow and sweet that made the room go quiet. Theodore Hayes stood at the front of the schoolhouse in a good dark suit, and watched Pauline come down the aisle with an expression that had nothing careful or guarded about it at all, which was, she thought, the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen on a human face. Clara Whitmore baked the wedding cake, which was 3 layers and covered in white frosting, and was, by general agreement, the best thing that had happened in Harlan Creek since the water tower. The wedding night was spent at Theodore's house, which Pauline was seeing properly for the first time, having been inside it briefly twice and not gotten further than the front parlor either time. It was a large, well-made house on the north edge of town, built from timber out of his own mill, with the precision and intention of a man who built things to last. It had a proper kitchen and a wide parlor with bookshelves that covered most of one wall, and a bedroom with a window that looked east toward the mountains. Pauline stood at that window in the morning light of the next day and looked at the mountains going gold in the early sun, and felt the specific and profound quality of happiness that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of something solid. Theodore brought her coffee and stood beside her at the window, and they watched the mountains together, and she put her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and outside the creek ran on, and the town woke up below them in the summer morning. She said, "I am going to need more bookshelves." "Tell me how many," he said. "I'll have them built." She laughed, and the sound of it in that solid, well-made house felt like the right sound for the place. The summer and fall of 1883 were the happiest months Pauline had known, not the fierce and temporary happiness of relief or novelty, but the deep and settled happiness of a life that was becoming itself. She continued at the millinery shop through the fall, partly because she genuinely enjoyed the work, and partly because she had become essential to it and Hester needed her. But she cut her hours back and used the rest of her time to make the house properly a home, filling its shelves and corners with the accumulated weight of 2 lives joined. She learned the full extent of what Theodore Hayes was in that time, not just the outline of it, which she had known since the first week, but the texture and detail. She sat in on his meetings when he invited her, which he did more and more as he found that her observations were worth having. She understood the mill operation and the bank accounts and the land holdings and the particular complicated web of obligation and generosity that he had built around himself, the way he was owed by everyone and owed everyone in turn, and how that web was actually a kind of community in the truest sense. She found the injustices in it too, and she named them, because she was not a woman who could see a thing clearly and stay quiet about it. The Shoshone families who lived on the land east of the creek, and whose water rights had been informally but not legally protected by Hayes's refusal to sell to developers who wanted to redirect the upper creek. She told him that informal protection was not enough, and that if he cared about it, he needed to make it formal. He listened to her. He spent a week consulting with his lawyer and with the Territorial Land Office, and made the water rights legally recorded in a way that could not be undone by informal arrangements or future salesmanship. She found the woman in the laundry district, the one who paid nearly 40% of her wages to the man who owned the laundry building in rent, and she told Theodore about it directly and without apology, and he looked into it and found the rent was out of proportion to the property's worth and renegotiated it. He did not publicize this. He never publicized anything. You would have found these things eventually, she said. Maybe, he said. You find them faster. Because I talk to people, she said. Because people talk to you, he said, which was a different and more accurate thing. She was right that they talked to her. The town had opened to Pauline Hayes the way the town had never quite opened to Theodore Hayes himself, not because they did not trust him, but because he was so large in their daily existence that speaking to him required a kind of preparation that speaking to Pauline did not. She was one of them, a woman who had arrived with a carpetbag and $42 and made herself a life, and they trusted that in a way that was not transferable through marriage. She used it carefully. She never carried stories back against the will of the people who had told them. She used what she learned to help where helping was needed and left the rest private. Theodore watched her do this, and she could see him learning from it, adjusting the way he moved through the town by degrees, becoming more visible and less monolithic. "You are making me a better owner," he told her once, and she said, "I am making you a better neighbor, which is more important," and he thought about that and said she was right. In November of 1883, Pauline told him she was expecting a child. He received this information in the kitchen of their house on a Tuesday morning before sunrise, with a cup of coffee in his hand and the lamp turned low, and the mountains invisible in the dark outside the window. And his face did something she had never seen it do, which was go through about 6 different emotions in rapid sequence, before settling on a specific kind of radiant joy that made him look 10 years younger. He set the coffee cup down very carefully and crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put both arms around her, and held on with a steadiness that was completely different from his usual steadiness, tighter and less contained. "We are having a baby," he said against the top of her head. "We are having a baby," she confirmed. He pulled back and looked at her face with the expression of a man trying to read a document in a language he doesn't know and desperately wants to. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you frightened? Is there anything you need?" "I am well," she said. "I am somewhat frightened, yes, and I would like more coffee, please." He got her coffee and sat beside her at the kitchen table, and they talked about it for 2 hours until the sun came up. The practical things and the frightening things and the wonderful things. And outside the mountains came visible in the first gray light, and then the gold caught their peaks, and she sat in her kitchen with her hands around her coffee mug, and the man she loved across the table, and thought about her mother, who would have been so glad. She said so, out loud. Theodore reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He said nothing. He did not need to. He understood grief and joy existing in the same moment because he had lived long enough to know that they always do. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was milder than the previous one, but still cold enough to remind everyone what winter meant in Wyoming. And Pauline moved through it with the particular grace of a woman who has found her footing, showing in the spring of her pregnancy, and continuing to work at the shop through February before Hester and Theodore. And Ida Mee formed an informal coalition and convinced her to slow down. She slowed down enough to satisfy them without stopping entirely, which she refused to do because she was not an invalid and doing nothing made her anxious. She read instead, going through Theodore's bookshelves systematically and occasionally borrowing from the collection the schoolteacher had accumulated. And she started a correspondence with a woman in Denver who was organizing a reading circle for frontier women. And she rearranged the east bedroom of the house into a proper nursery with the help of Clara Whitmore, who had opinions about nursery organization that were detailed and largely correct. The baby came in the last week of April, in the same spring-thaw season that had seen Pauline and Theodore first say what they meant to each other, which she found appropriate and Theodore found hopeful. The baby was a boy. He came into the world at 4 in the morning with the indignant urgency of someone with important business, and Dr. Ellery, who had arrived in time and who was, whatever his office's multitasking, a very good doctor, put the infant into Pauline's arms with a satisfaction that suggested the whole thing had gone well. Pauline looked at her son for a long time without speaking. He was red and furious looking, and had a quantity of dark hair that seemed excessive for someone who had been in the world for 6 minutes, and he was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen. Theodore sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby with an expression so unguarded and full that she felt her eyes fill. "Hello," he said to the baby, in the low, even voice that he used for important things. "We have been waiting for you." They named him James William Hayes, for Theodore's grandfather on his mother's side, and for the general principle that certain names hold a kind of solidity that serves a person well. James William turned out to be a child of strong opinions and loud convictions, which Pauline said came from her side and Theodore said could be attributed to either side depending on which quality was being celebrated or explained, and the argument about this became one of the running gentle jokes of their household. The boy was healthy and loud and curious about everything, and the town took to him in the proprietary way that small communities take to children who belong to people they love. Dell at the livery had James on a horse before he was 2 years old, supervised and controlled, and with Pauline watching from the fence with an expression that mixed maternal terror and amusement in roughly equal parts. Hester made him a small winter hat and refused to let anyone else make it. Clara Whitmore's cornbread, which was legendary, apparently contained a special variety reserved for James, which was exactly the same as the regular variety, but Clara insisted otherwise. Theodore Hayes, the man who owned the town, spent considerable amounts of his time lying on the floor of the east bedroom making various undignified noises to make his son laugh, which the son found hilarious, and which Pauline found both touching and slightly surreal given what she knew of the man's professional demeanor. "You are completely different with him," she said once, watching. "Of course I am," he said from the floor, making a face at James that James received with the screaming delight of a baby who considers his father's capacity for absurdity a personal gift. "I mean it as a compliment," she said. He looked up at her from the floor with his son on his chest and his hair disheveled, and the unguarded joy in his eyes that she had come to know as the truest version of him, the version that had been waiting inside the careful, composed owner of Harlan Creek for a very long time. "I know," he said. In the summer of 1885, when James was learning to walk with the devastating enthusiasm of someone who has just discovered forward motion and has decided to apply it to everything, Pauline found out she was expecting again. She told Theodore in the same kitchen where she had told him about James, this time in the evening with the lamp up and the windows open to the summer air and James audible in the next room conducting a detailed conversation with his wooden horse. Theodore received this news with fewer sequential emotions and more immediate joy, which she noted as evidence of growth. "Is it different the second time?" he asked. "Are you less frightened?" "Somewhat less," she said. "I now know it is survivable. That helps." "It helps me too," he said and kissed her, which was the right answer. The second baby came in February of 1886, in the kind of deep winter cold that makes the world very white and very quiet, and was a girl with Pauline's dark eyes and Theodore's stubbornness, which became apparent approximately 30 seconds after her arrival, when she had opinions about everything and no hesitation about expressing them. They named her Clara Margaret Hayes, the first name for Clara Whitmore, who had fed them through every season of their marriage, and who cried about the honor in a way that required 2 handkerchiefs and an eventual piece of cornbread to settle, and the second for Pauline's mother, who had never seen Wyoming but who had made the woman who had. James, at not quite 2, was deeply suspicious of Clara Margaret for approximately 4 days, during which he addressed her as the baby, with an inflection that suggested she was a problem that had arrived without being requested, and then fell helplessly in love with her in the way of older siblings everywhere. Which is to say, he decided she was his responsibility, and executed this decision by sitting beside her and patting her head every few minutes, and presenting her with things he considered valuable, which at that stage of his development included a pebble from the creek, a piece of cornbread, and the wooden horse. Theodore watched this and said quietly to Pauline, "He is going to be someone's person when he grows up, completely committed." "He gets that from you," she said. "I won't argue with that," he said. "The years moved in the way that good years do, which is with the deceptive speed of things that are right." Harlan Creek grew in the way that Wyoming was growing in those years of the late 1880s. More settlers coming through, new businesses arriving, the railroad sending a spur line that the town debated for 2 years, and then built with the inevitable momentum of economic necessity. Theodore Hayes navigated the arrival of the railroad and the subsequent changes to the land values and the commerce of the town with the same combination of strategic intelligence and genuine care that had characterized everything he had built. He did not always get it right. There were decisions he regretted, and things he misjudged, and a particularly difficult year in 1887, when the cattle market collapsed, and the bank had to absorb losses that tested everything he had built. Pauline sat with him through that year, in the office with its maps and ledgers, and helped him think through the options with the clear head and steady nerve that were her most useful qualities in a crisis. They did not agree on everything, and they argued with the frank directness of two people who respect each other enough to disagree without it being a threat to anything. But they worked through it together, and the bank held, and the families with loans survived, and the town came through it diminished but intact. Hester retired from the millinery shop in 1888 and gave the shop to Pauline outright, which Pauline argued about for a week, and then accepted, because Hester was immovable once she had made up her mind about something, and because Pauline loved the shop and would take care of it, and they both knew it. She kept it running through all the changes and expansions and difficulties of those years, the shop becoming a kind of anchor point in the town's life, the way such places become when they are run by someone people trust. The town, for its part, continued to be the complicated and lively, and sometimes difficult place that frontier towns always were. There were years of drought and years of flood and years of prosperity and years of hardship, and through all of them the question of what it meant to own a town and what responsibilities came with that ownership was a constant conversation between Pauline and Theodore, one they never fully resolved because it was not resolvable, only navigable, but which they navigated with increasing skill and mutual respect. The Shoshone families along the East Creek, whose water rights Theodore had formalized at Pauline's urging, became a constant and valued part of the town's life, and the relationship between them and the town grew more honest over the years than it had been, which was not perfect, because history and injustice do not resolve cleanly, but which was better for being acknowledged and worked on rather than ignored. James Hayes grew up in that town as someone who knew it from all angles, the son of the man who owned it, but also a child who had been on Dell's horses and eaten Clara Whitmore's cornbread, and learned to read in the schoolhouse his father had funded, and caught crawdads in the East Creek with the children of the Shoshone families and the children of the cattle ranchers and everyone else. He had his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, and he was genuinely, fundamentally good, which his parents received with the combination of gratitude and wonder that parents receive the best qualities of their children. Clara Margaret grew up asking questions about everything and refusing to accept insufficient answers, which drove her schoolteachers to distraction and her parents to enormous private pride. She wanted to know why the railroad had been built where it was and not further north, and why the water rights had been structured the way they were, and what it meant that her father owned the bank, and who decided what things were worth. These questions were not comfortable ones, but they were important ones, and her parents answered them as honestly as they could, including the parts where the answers were complicated and incomplete. In the spring of 1890, when James was 6 and Clara Margaret was 4, and the Wyoming Territory was in the process of becoming the state of Wyoming, which happened in July of that year, with the additional distinction of being the first state to grant women the right to vote, a detail that Pauline noted to Theodore with considerable satisfaction. Pauline stood at the east window of their house in the morning light and watched the mountains and felt the particular quality of happiness she had been feeling for most of 7 years, the deep and settled kind, the kind that had grown roots. Theodore came to stand beside her with the coffee, as he had done on their first morning in this house and on most mornings since. James's voice was audible from the kitchen where he was conducting negotiations with Clara Margaret over some matter of childhood justice. "What are you thinking about?" Theodore asked. She looked at the mountains. "About the blizzard," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "November of 1882, he said. "You handed me your coat," she said, "and I didn't know who you were. I just knew you were a man who gave a stranger his coat in a blizzard without any ceremony about it." "And," he said. She looked at him. The gray eyes were the same as they had always been, only warmer now, the way eyes get warm when they have spent years looking at things worth seeing. "And I think that is the truest thing I know about you," she said. "Everything else, the mill and the bank and the land and all of it, that is all real and it matters. But the coat and the blizzard, that is who you actually are." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You were standing there turning blue. What else was I supposed to do?" "Most people would have walked past," she said. "I am not most people," he said. "No," she said, and put her hand over his where it rested on the window frame. "You are not." Outside, the mountains held their snow at the peaks even in the spring warmth, and the creek ran fast with melt water, and the town below them went about its morning, the smoke from the chimneys rising straight in the still air, the sounds of horses and boots on boards and voices calling to each other in the morning, the sound of a place that was alive and working and full of people making their lives. Clara Margaret appeared at the parlor door with an expression of elaborate grievance and announced that James had eaten her piece of cornbread, which Clara Whitmore had sent over the previous evening and which Clara Margaret had been saving for breakfast, and that this was an injustice requiring immediate parental attention. James appeared behind her with an expression of equally elaborate innocence, holding a piece of cornbread that could very plausibly have been a different, entirely legitimate piece, and said he had not eaten her piece, and the piece he was eating was the one he had been saving, which was a defense that satisfied no one. Theodore and Pauline looked at each other. She went to adjudicate the cornbread situation, which required producing the remainder of Clara Whitmore's delivery from the kitchen safe and distributing it equitably, and with the kind of ceremony that small children require to believe that justice has been served. Theodore watched from the doorway with his coffee and the expression that she loved best on him, the fully open one, no guard and no distance, just a man who had built a life and was standing in the middle of it and knew exactly what he had. Clara Whitmore arrived at mid-morning with another fresh batch of cornbread, because she had some sense of these situations, and was received by both children with the reverence due to someone who has solved a problem in the most satisfying possible way. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee with Pauline and talked about the state ceremony coming in July, and what it meant for the territory, and what Pauline thought women would do with the vote. And Pauline told her exactly what she thought, in detail, while James and Clara Margaret ate cornbread on the back step and conducted a negotiated peace. Theodore came in from his morning at the mill office at noon and found the kitchen full of women talking and children eating, and the smell of the fresh cornbread and the warmth of the stove and the particular noise of a house that is fully inhabited. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and took off his coat. Pauline looked up at him across the room. He looked back at her with the gray eyes and the full, real smile that was only for her, and she felt it in the center of her chest, the same small, steady pressure she had felt for 8 years, unchanged in its quality, deepened in its weight. She smiled back. James asked his father if the buffalo that Dell had told him about were really gone and why, which opened a conversation that Theodore handled with the honesty the question deserved, and the care that his son's understanding required, telling him about the hunting and the hides and the deliberate destruction of a way of life. And James listened with the serious attention of a child who is processing something large, and then said that it was wrong, in the simple declarative way of children who have not yet learned to soften true things. And Theodore said that it was, yes, it was wrong, and some wrongs cannot be undone but only acknowledged and remembered. Clara Whitmore left in the early afternoon, loaded down with a bonnet Pauline had trimmed for her and the determined farewells of both children, and the house settled into the quieter warmth of the afternoon, the children napping, the house breathing gently around them. Theodore sat at his desk in the corner of the parlor with his ledgers, and Pauline sat in the armchair by the window with a book she was only half reading, and the afternoon light came through the glass and moved slowly across the floor, and there was no sound but the creak and the occasional creak of the house and the turning of pages. She looked over at him. He was working, his head bent, his hand moving steadily across the page, but he had tilted his chair very slightly in her direction, which he always did, this barely perceptible orientation, as though she were a compass point he was accounting for without making a production of it. She went back to her book. Outside, the world was Wyoming in the spring of 1890, complicated and beautiful and full of change, a territory becoming a state, a frontier becoming something else, the old wildness giving way to roads and railroads and law offices and schoolhouses and all the trappings of civilization, both good and complicated. It was not a simple world, and it had never been. It held injustice alongside beauty and hardship alongside grace and the constant ongoing work of people trying to do better than they had done before. But in this house, in this particular Wednesday afternoon, the ledgers rustled and the book turned and the creek ran outside, and in the east bedroom James and Clara Margaret slept the deep sleep of children who are safe and loved, and Pauline Blackwell Hayes sat in the last of the afternoon light and felt the solidity of what she had found in this place. She had come to Harlan Creek with $42 and a carpetbag and a desperate need to start over. She had stood in a blizzard on a street she did not know and been given a coat by a man she would come to love in the most thorough way she knew how to love anything. She had not known who he was in that moment. She had known who he was from the first second, a man who, seeing someone cold and stranded and in trouble, gave what he had without calculation or ceremony. The rest of it, the mill and the bank and the town and the years, had only confirmed the first thing. Theodore looked up from his ledger as though he had felt her attention. She said, "I love you." He put his pen down. He said, "I love you," back, with the same direct and uncomplicated honesty with which he had first said it in the early spring evening beside the creek, the year before everything they had built together had begun. Outside, a horse went past on the main road. Somewhere down the street Clara Whitmore was probably baking again. The creek ran and the mountains stood and the town went on with its business of being alive. Theodore Hayes picked his pen back up and went back to his ledgers, and Pauline Hayes went back to her book, and the afternoon light moved another inch across the floor of the house that he had built, the house that was theirs, in the town that was both his and not his and was becoming, day by day and decision by decision, more truly everyone's, in the wide and golden spring of a new American state. The moment was complete. Nothing was missing. Everything that mattered was right here, in this room, in this town, in this life they had made together out of a blizzard and a coat and two people who had needed, more than anything, to find someone worth building with. And they had.